Our next panel is on decentralization, the future of the open web. Our moderator, Anthony Rosborough, is an assistant professor of law and assistant professor of computer science here at the Schulich School of Law. Argyri Panezi is a professor of law and Canada Research Chair in Digital Information Law and Policy at the University of New Brunswick. And Evan Prodromou is a research director at the Social Web Foundation. He's also the co-author of the ActivityPub Protocol and Activity Streams 2.0 data format, known for its foundational contributions to the Fediverse. And Anthony, you're moderating this, so I will turn it over to you.
Sure. Can everyone hear me all right? Should I be? Okay. It's good that I asked that question, isn't it? All right, well, welcome everyone to this panel. So I guess I'll maybe just imbue this panel with a little bit of my thoughts as a bit of an outsider to this topic before we engage in some questions. And so when I think of decentralization and the future of the open web, I think of the last 25, 30 years of the internet, the kind of that spirit in which the founding kind of people that gave the internet its energy initially were speaking about it with this cool mix of like libertarianism and anti-capitalism, the kind of John Perry Barlow's. And it seems like we've come a long way from that, right? We now have, like, rich in our lexicon is Cory Doctorow's in shitification. We understand that the internet is, maybe no longer a site of individual pursuits and goals and dreams, but is increasingly a place of capture of our time and energy and then being sold back to us in different ways. And so when we think of, I guess, the open web, this decentralization, for me, it harkens me back to some of the kind of the promise of the internet from the 1990s. And so apologies if, I guess, being somewhat of an outsider of this topic, I have that kind of, still a bit of that belief that maybe the internet could be a force for good. Apologies for my naivety. But what I thought we would do maybe is kick it off with just like an open conversation, some just framing and first principles about describing the problem of centralization itself. And how would you all kind of describe, if we're talking about decentralization, I guess my question is, what is the problem of centralization of the internet?
I've been talking a lot. Why don't I defer to my colleagues first?
I can start maybe by, sharing your view that I also think of the cyber libertarian, the times of the cyber euphoria when we thought that the internet is this information superhighway and everyone can ride their own vehicle on it, fine. We know we've departed from that, but I feel that you're very right to say, okay, what do we mean by decentralization? Which choke points are we focusing on? And I'm thinking that, it really depends on who you're talking and which layer do you want to focus on, because in simplifying things, tech standards layer, software layer, content layer, I might be contributing more to the discussion here today on thinking about the content layer, but I think that all of these layers are relevant when we talk about centralization, decentralization. And the internet that we experience today has very few players. And I think that bigness is an important discussion, and we can talk about it on the basis of competition law or antitrust, but also how other fields of law are dealing with big tech. And I think we've had a fair amount of discussion today around the difficulties of controlling tech platforms, the big tech giants. But at the same time, I also think that what we are recently focusing on is that big tech also comes from a very particular place in the universe. So when we talk about decentralization, we also, I hope, start to think about initiatives that do not come from this one place in the world, which is tied to the history of the cyber libertarian ethos that you're talking about, right? This is a North American narrative of the 90s. Exported to the rest of the world.
So there's kind of like not only a technical decentralization, but like a cultural, geographic decentralization. Yeah. Evan, just
yeah, do you mind if I go
Please.
1, 2, 1, 2. One of my favorite books on this topic is by Tim Wu. It's called The Master Switch. And it's an excellent analysis of communication technologies going back to telegraph, and a repeated pattern of an explosive growth that's very diverse, very decentralized, whether it's telegraph, telephone, radio, television, cable television, which had its own growth, and then finally the internet, as this like very explosive, lots of participants, lots of diversity, lots of exploration, and then almost like the blob reforming, right? You see consolidation, acquisition, or extermination of competitors until you have only a few participants left, right? And then often what happens is a next communications technology has an equivalent explosion of that diversity, right? I think what we see as a problem with centralization is not something new or confusing, right? It's been something that we've understood as a problem with markets for centuries, that having monopolies, having monopsonies, right, single buyer markets is bad for all other participants in the market, that it cuts down on consumer choice, and it encourages rent-seeking behavior like Cory Doctorow talks about in shittification.
So there's been so many great references so far to John Perry Barlow, to Tim. I'm going to add one more, which is Jonathan Zittrain had a book a couple decades ago called The Future of the Internet and How to Stop It, which I thought was prescient. And what I liked is I heard him give a talk more recently where he said his sequel to that book was going to be called, Well, We Tried. I think the challenge around centralization needs to be understood in architectural terms. And the way that I would frame it is it's a problem based on the fact that the applications that we depend on to do virtually everything online rely on this consolidated, platform-dominated infrastructure, which is mainly outside of the control of the people that are using these systems. So if you take collaboration to develop a document, Anthony, you and I want to collaborate to develop a document. So I'll have my computer open over here. It's got plenty of processing power to do it. And you'll have your computer open over there. It's got plenty of processing to do it on your side too. But how are we doing it? Well, we're going to use Google Docs, right? So what that means is I'm not the one who's doing this machine that I own is not actually doing the work. The machine that you own is not actually doing the work. It's living on Google's infrastructure, right? Similar to if we're going to have a video conference, right? Well, what are we doing? Are we doing it via Zoom? Are we doing it via Teams? Are we doing it via Google Meetup? All of the options that we have require the infrastructure to be held in the hands of this third party. And it's overwhelmingly one of a handful of large American-owned companies. And it's so natural, and it feels so intuitive to us to be doing things that way, that it's easy to miss the fact that it doesn't have to work this way. There are architectural and design reasons why the internet works this way, why our applications work this way. Mostly, there are a lot of them are legacy reasons. A lot of them relate to securitization and my ability to make sure that the person that I'm collaborating with or speaking to on the other end of the line is who I think they are and is someone that I can trust. But the point that I want to make is having our infrastructure set up this way means that we are effectively at the mercy of this handful of major companies. And while 20, 30, 40 years ago, there was a reason why we needed to set things up this way, particularly because of a lack of processing power on our own machines, a lack of security capacity on our own machines. We no longer need to do it that way, but we do it because this is the way our entire digital economy is set up. And it effectively means that a huge amount of things that we want to do are controlled by these third parties, by these big centralized infrastructure hubs. And to me, the discourse around decentralization, the discourse around, we were trying to think of different words for it, whether it's better to call it network democratization or internet or media diversification. It's about trying to think outside of this current paradigm that we're in and trying to find structural software architectural solutions that allow us to continue to communicate, continue to do the things that we need to do online, and to do that in a way that we're not at the mercy of this handful of large companies.
Can I jump on one more time? Sorry. I promise I won't make any more references, but I will make a reference, showing my tech background here, to some mathematical properties of networks. There is a well-known mathematical property of networks called Metcalfe's law. It comes from Bob Metcalfe, who was a executive at 3Com in the 80s, who noted that the value of a network is dependent on the square of the number of participants. It's dependent on the number of connections that are possible rather than the number of people actually participating in the network. But it just means that big networks get bigger much faster than small networks, so that if you're collaborating using, if Michael wants to use a document system different from Google Docs, he's got pressure to join Google Docs, pressure to use the more dominant ones, and those pressures are extremely strong, and the bigger the network gets, the more strong those pressures are.
No, I agree, and that's kind of where I was going with that the switch costs are high, and I feel that our policies are not doing a great job thinking about the role that path dependency plays in our current choices. We made choices at the beginning in the 90s, and they lead us to. We just don't want to go back. Obviously, it's not intuitive. And I'd link that to bring another narrative to the table, to the tyranny of convenience. I mean, I need to learn a new tool. We're all already used to the Google platforms, the Microsoft platforms, or if we go back to the pandemic times, Zoom, Teams, it's the few same platforms. And if you switch platform, you're losing your time. You're downloading everything again, etc. So it's natural that people follow go down a path that they've started. But when this becomes problematic, it's interesting and it's difficult to see how maybe laws, regulations deal with these path dependency issues.
A couple of thoughts that maybe you can pick and choose from. But so, Michael, you were talking a lot about architectural centralization, so the technology of the internet being centralized. But Argyri, you kind of mentioned a little bit about geographic centralization. I also get the sense that there's an element here of commercial centralization, so anti-competitiveness or consolidation of market power. And so when we're talking about decentralization of the internet, I guess, is it right to think about this primarily as an architectural problem, or is this also kind of a human problem, a market problem, to borrow from Lessig? Does it have all four modalities firing at once? Would be my question. And I guess tied to that is kind of why, from a normative perspective, why do we want to have a more open internet? Other than the fact that this consolidates power and we don't like that, that we're all kind of dependent on the same technologies and that really results in certain people being very powerful and perhaps we don't like that. What are the benefits, I guess, to the end user that we should be thinking about? Like what is the prophecy of an open web that would resonate with people, would be my question. So there's kind of two questions there.
I can maybe start there, right? Which is one of the benefits from individual point of view of having decentralization and different options is that we get consumer choice, right? So today, if I'm doing, say, social networking, sharing photos, I have a very small set of choices, maybe an Instagram, something like that, which has a very particular business model, has particular technical restrictions, et cetera, that I'm able to participate in, versus having 10 or 20 I know it sounds crazy to say there would be 10 or 20 different social networks, right? But having those choices would mean that one might have a subscription model, one might have a different algorithm that operates in a different way than Instagram does, right? And having that choice is one thing that we expect in market-based economies that helps us have better products, helps us have better experiences, and kind of improves our overall system, right? It's kind of how capitalism is supposed to work, right?
Right.
Great, and if I was also I agree that we want to give consumers, we want to give people more choice, and then choice brings more autonomy, more control, and all of these three concepts are fitting into each other. And I wanted to go back to the technological sovereignty discussions that we already had in the previous panel. We heard tech sovereignty in this room, and it's kind of a buzzword recently, digital sovereignty, tech sovereignty, which strikes to me as a big paradox, since we were celebrating back to Barlow, right? That this is a space, cyberspace is where no sovereign has place, et cetera. And we have come all the way to seeking, to wanting, to embracing tech sovereignty from very different parts of the world. The EU has been leading the way with a whole regulatory package to achieve technological sovereignty, and then this narrative has become very dominant. So. Thinking about our discussion here, I think we need to acknowledge the paradox that we're moving away from what we were celebrating from this open network. But also, if we're looking for more choices, if we want to promote autonomy and control, then what we're really thinking about here is not tech sovereignty, is individual autonomy. If you want to call it individual sovereignty, fine. That was in defining tech sovereignty, which is already a term that is borrowed from international law, control over a territory and where no other sovereign controls. But if we think about individual autonomy, we want control over our bodies, our data, and our choices. Do we have control over our data and our choices? And with the Internet of Things and the Internet of Body, slowly we won't have control over data in our brains and bodily function. So that's why, because we have less and less individual autonomy.
So I completely agree with the individual autonomy questions. I agree with the digital sovereignty questions. I agree with the free market questions, which is supposed to be how this works, which is you have lots of different choices. Choices are supposed to be how the market operates. I'll add an angle to this insofar as I think your prompt asked about the law and policy components of how we got here. Because I think fundamentally there are technical and architectural reasons why we are where we are. I think that's the primary, if you want to follow the trail of breadcrumbs right back to the beginning. There were architectural decisions that led us here. But I think that it's a law, what we have today is also fundamentally a law and policy problem, because as the internet developed the way that it did, this regulatory infrastructure also developed in the same way, which assumed a structure of centralization around our networks, and which served to reinforce a structure of centralization around a lot of, particularly around the application layer, but generally around the character of the internet as a whole. So what I mean in particular is, for example, in a previous panel, I talked about the deputization of platforms to do things like content moderation over questions of IP violations, right? One of the practical impacts of that is it raises the cost of operating a platform, so that if you are a Facebook or a Twitter or a YouTube, you can price that in because you have the scale to police IP violations. But if you are running a smaller Mastodon instance, The cost of doing that can be prohibitive, and it raises the guardrails, it raises the barriers to entry for people that are doing it on a smaller commercial scale. Now, none of this is an argument to say like, well, we shouldn't hold platforms, we shouldn't hold Meta and Facebook accountable for IP violations and for all the harms that they cause. The point that I'm trying to make, though, is that the legal infrastructure that we have assumes and reinforces a platform-dominated communication space, and that if we want to think seriously about moving away from that paradigm, if we think that the platform domination of our discourse is problematic, we need to think constructively about the laws that we have that reinforce that, and how to construct a legal landscape that allows for competitive and smaller and decentralized competitors to arise. So that's one example. I think another example, which I think flows into the competition aspect of this, is we allow and countenance all kinds of anti-competitive behaviors among the biggest players, like adding friction to prevent interoperability, like creating obstacles towards porting out your social graph, your network towards competitors. There's all these mechanisms in place that the bigger players do to try to lock in their user base, and the fact that we allow that to happen, or don't consider that anti-competitive content, or anti-competitive behavior, or don't mandate things like interoperability, adversarial interoperability. All of these are infrastructural, are law and policy questions which entrench the status quo. I don't know that there is any comprehensive treatment about like, what does a law and policy regime that really fosters a decentralized network look like? I put a proposal in recently to do that, and it didn't get funded, so, you know, maybe next time. But I do think that we need to think, as law and policy scholars, there is an important component for us to play to try to figure out the pieces of the puzzle that are in front of us, which are ensuring that the system that we have continues and preventing any competitors from rising up.
So, okay, so maybe a follow-up question then is, whether it's legal architecture we're talking about or technical architecture of the internet, if the goal is to kind of introduce openness at one end of that spectrum or another, how can that be done without it being co-opted by the very large platforms that I speak from experience, I suppose, in the right to repair context, where you see this co-optation happening a lot, right? And how do you develop like a new technical and legal reality outside of dominant commercial players? Like, how do you not be co-opted in the process?
I'll jump in. I don't have a magic answer to that. I wish I did, right? But it is something that, say during our 90s golden era of the internet was a real threat, right? It was considered a pretty big deal. Microsoft decided to start internet enabling the Windows operating system and bringing Windows into the internet. And, during the monopoly proceedings around Microsoft, the Java language, et cetera, there were a lot of exposed emails that said, boy, we can't wait to take over this internet thing, right? We're going to embrace, extend, and extinguish was the term that they used. I think that the way that we keep that co-optation from happening is through competition, right? So having what didn't happen for us is we don't all live on the Microsoft internet. By the time Microsoft joined the internet, there were enough other players who were active in the space that we now have something of a number of different companies working in that area, and no one company can quite take it over. Now, they've all established little fiefdoms in their own parts of that internet space, but I think that the way that prevent co-optation of the network is by having competition by multiple players at multiple sizes, right? And that's not a magic bullet, but it may be one way that we do it.
Okay, so I think the best analogy for how to do this in terms of knowing, avoiding being co-opted came from Cory Doctorow. He cites the Odyssey. Fittingly, we have 3 Greek Canadians on this panel. It comes from the Odyssey. By the way, I'm pretty sure there's only like 3 Greek Canadians in the tech policy space in this country. It's very funny to me that we're all on this panel. Okay, so he mentioned this in the context of Blue Sky, where he was asked about, like, how come you're not on Blue Sky? So in the Odyssey, Odysseus is sailing past the sirens, right? The sirens are these mythical creatures, and they sing to the crews of passing ships. And anybody who hears their song will jump into the water and drown. So Odysseus wants to hear the sirens without being forced into the water and drowning. So he has his crew tie him to the mast of the ship. He leaves his ears unplugged. Everybody else on the crew puts wax in their ears so they won't be tempted, and they're able to sail past the sirens. Now, the key point to this is he told his crew in advance, I am going to beg you to untie me and let me jump into the water. I'm going to be screaming and threatening you and everything you can imagine. I'm going to insist that you untie me and let me jump into the water. Don't let me jump into the water. I will leave that decision of whether or not to jump into the water outside of my control by tying myself to the mast, by having my crew tie me to the mast and giving them specific instructions early on not to listen to me when I beg to be able to drown. So where I'm going with all of this is you can't leave it to a game time decision as to whether or not you're going to be co-opted and the direction that you're going to go. The way that this relates back to Blue Sky is he said, similar to that decision that Odysseus made, you need to have an infrastructure in place which makes it impossible, structurally impossible, to be co-opted, and which doesn't leave it in the hands of individuals. You need to have a system in place that anticipates that people are going to come along and try to co-opt it and is resilient in anticipation of that. So for Blue Sky, their answer to this is to have a robust system of interoperability, to have their source code as essentially public and open source, and their idea is that if they become too powerful and too evil, because there is a system in place that'll allow anyone to build a clone of their website and essentially allow people to port over, that's how they hedge against turning evil and dominating the information space. Now, is that an effective way of doing it? Are there ways around it? I don't know, because Blue Sky is still relatively early. It's not as robust as you see on Mastodon, which is a pure system of federation and is much more resilient against being taken over. Yeah. But my point is, there are different technical and policy and structural ways that you can guard against that. But the most important thing is that you have to not only predict, not only guard against that happening, you have to assume that it's going to happen. And you have to have all your measures and all your safeguards in place from day one, so that you never get to the point where a human being is making the decision about whether the company should go in a bad direction.
So I'll take this to the content layer. So if you want to have a follow-up on the social media platforms,
sure.
Please go ahead.
No, you go.
Okay. I completely agree with everything. I'm just more comfortable contributing to this discussion from the perspective of the content layer and access to data, I guess. Since another difficult space to regulate would be artificial intelligence, and there again we're trying not to make the same mistake, and anticipatory regulation didn't really work, as we've seen. But anyways, the lesson to be learned is exactly the same, and I think that in this respect, leveling the playing field, meaning providing bulk access to data to more companies that could innovate in this space, would be the equivalent of the social media, democratizing the social media platform space that Michael was just talking about. Again, we see that the legislative frameworks in place are benefiting centralization, right? If you think about our IP ecosystem and copyright in particular, is less or more resilient depending on which jurisdictions you look at, but has definitely not solved this fundamental question. Are we are we allowing enough space for new entrants to innovate? Not just because the market has space, that there's enough space in the market, regulatory barriers, but also do they have access to data, similar access to data as the big tech companies have. So that would be a replicating story from the perspective of AI and startup and the AI startup ecosystem, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, sorry, I'll jump in here again. I think it's really interesting the place we are in right now with artificial intelligence. In 2008, Wikipedia had over 800 social networks listed on their list of social networks, the high fives and the Bebos and the Orcuts and all these systems that are no longer around, right? They were driven by a kind of venture capital economy that pumped money into a lot of different horses, seeing which one was going to run, and then, killed off anything that wasn't a finalist. And we're currently in that place with AI, right? So we have a lot of different participants in the market. There are a number of different systems out there. They're very aggressively growing. They're dumping literally trillions of dollars into growth. But, likely situation is that many of the players in artificial intelligence today will not be around in 2 years, 3 years. I think that we are on our way to consolidation and centralization in that place, just as much as we've seen it in social networks before.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Question, I guess, to follow up, on these questions of exclusivity and safety and privacy. On the one hand, openness, in my experience, in advocating for openness in a different field, like the responses you get from large commercial interests is like, well, this presents challenges for us to continue our current business model. This presents safety risks, privacy risks, competitive risks, perhaps even national security risks. And so you have all of this fear mongering, right, coming from large commercial interests. And so I guess the question is, is the solution to mitigating all of that just a technical standard? Like, is that just a technical fix? Or is there something kind of else, maybe rhetorical, social, in terms of human relations that also has to take place here in order to kind of make the case for this? Because, as you mentioned, like, the intellectual property and the commercialization aspect of this is huge. And, we hear the name OpenAI, and it's kind of like the openness there is almost laughable, right? It's almost like IKEA being a nonprofit. It's like, it's kind of a joke. And so I'm just curious to know, like, what are your thoughts, and how do we address these kind of the concerns of industry that will be very reluctant to jump onto openness that kind of leaves them vulnerable, at least rhetorically, to these kind of forces?
I have a very short answer, only to touch on the security issue that you asked and the safety. And that's, I think, we really need to resist the narrative that the centralized systems are more secure. Because there is one core point of vulnerability versus decentralizing network points of access. It strengthens the security of the network. So that's something that I think we need to push back on. And then let me stop here and I'll come back, because I had another thought that I forgot. Your IKEA comment threw me.
Sure. Okay, so just in terms of like the concerns of industry. So I would take with a grain of salt anything that Meta and Alphabet and these big tech companies, arguments that they make for why things that are against their commercial interests are also bad for national security, because they're going to tell us What's in their interest to tell us? There's an army of smart and well-presented lobbyists for all of these companies who will argue very eloquently for why what's good for Alphabet and Meta is actually good for all of us. And I think you need to take that with a grain of salt. That said, I do think that there's a real tension there. And so I think that it's heavily contextual. So yes, one central store of data is riskier than 1,000 small stores of data. It's a big target. I get that. But when you talk about, for example, the platform space, right? Having major platforms as hubs of communication, as effective gatekeepers for the entirety of the public discourse, and having that take place in 3 or 4 places, does make it a lot easier to police, right? So if we want to talk about something like foreign interference or misinformation, it's way easier to track and target misinformation networks that are going on X or in Instagram or on Meta than it would be in Mastodon, because it's just it is more resilient to control and effective policing. Now, X is a bad example because X has, I believe, precisely 0 mechanisms to prevent foreign election interference. X is a vector of foreign election interference right now. So it's a feature, not a bug of that system. So that's a bad example. But in terms of the centralization versus decentralization discourse, there is a tension there. And likewise, on the privacy versus interoperability thing, that's a real tension. That's something that folks in the EU are grappling with right now. They have interoperability mandates. Doing that securely is a technical challenge, because the more people that you let in the door, the less control you have over your information, and there is a fundamental tension there. But these are in many cases, these are technological questions that are not insoluble. There's a tension there, but it doesn't mean that there's no avenue forward. In many cases, these are social and political and educational questions, right? So I want to acknowledge the tension that's there. That is something that smart people need to grapple with. But I also don't think that that is a response to trying to move forward in this space, and do want to flag that some of the people who are arguing that it is that it is an insoluble challenge have a direct financial reason for making those arguments.
Starting to realize that I'm sounding like the libertarian on the panel, and that might not be the free marketeer who sees a market providing solutions for everything. But I do actually think that in the case of security, it is a place where diversity of choices give a lot of options. None of us gets to choose how Facebook maintains our data privacy, but we can make choices when we are looking at other kinds of platforms, right? And we can say this one does have a better security system, or it's got a better security ranking or rating. Those individual platforms can use, again, an open market of security providers, consultants, et cetera, to help them with their work. And it also, the closer that we drive the platform provider towards the individual users. So LinkedIn may not treat my particular personal data as particularly precious, but a platform run by my organization, my nonprofit, where I'm one of a handful of people, is much more, my data is much more precious to that organization, and so they're going to treat it much better and value my privacy more. So I think that smaller systems tend to focus more on the needs of the individual users, especially around security and privacy. So again, it is an advantage to have one big lever you can switch, but I think that there are some other advantages that come from that diversity that can maybe offset it.
Yeah, And maybe back to your question about, is this a technical question or a discussion about social norms and values, etc. This balancing, which it's a very difficult balancing act that we're asked to engage in. This is a cultural and social question, a philosophical question, not only a technical question. Yeah.
I guess that leads me to ask a little bit about what are your thoughts on, when we talk about openness and decentralization, we have like a high watermark of the current state of affairs, right, which is a high degree of centralization, a very few players. But then throughout the comments so far, we've heard different interpretations of what decentralization and openness means. On the one hand, Blue Sky seems to be one step in the right direction, but not going quite as far as Mastodon. And so is the reality, is the end goal of a more open and decentralized internet that we all have home servers and personal websites running on our home computers? Like, what level of granularity are we happy with in terms of openness and decentralization to call the kind of goal achieved? And I know that there's not going to be a clear answer to that, but just curious to hear what your thoughts are on how can we mark kind of success in becoming more open and more decentralized?
I think one, definitional part of openness that we use in technology is that it is available for anyone to join, right? So if I want to participate in the Blue Sky network or Mastodon network, which are connected, by the way, you can follow people across networks, that I can set up a system, turn it on, and be part of the network today. It's a permissionless system, and that gives us the chance, if I can set up my Raspberry Pi in my basement and connect to this network, that also means that startups or existing technology providers or other possible providers can also don't need permission to join that network, right? And so I think one aspect of that openness, besides transparency, other aspects of openness, is that it's a permissionless system that anyone can join in. And again, keep hammering on this, and that does give us more choice.
Yeah. And on the user side, more choice, more privacy-friendly environments or ecosystems, more control over our data, over our content. That would, I think, be an ideal or a better space than where we're now.
Yeah, I mean, so my vision for a better internet is not that nobody can use Google or Meta or X or whatever. Partly because I think that's unrealistic, but also, I mean, when we're talking about openness and user autonomy, if people want to go with these platforms, they can go with these platforms. I think there's two values that I would pursue. I think one of them is decentralization as a viable alternative for people who want to pursue it. And I think that's not what we have right now. I think that if you want to avoid the big five, big however many it is, if you want to avoid the big tech companies, you really need to live your life in a very particular and intentional way. I mean, obviously, like, you can go and live in a cabin in the woods and grow your own food. But I mean, if you want to live a normal networked life where you have a real job and you get the news from an online source, it's very difficult to do that without engaging with the big platforms in some way. We're all dependent on them to a varying degree. And if you want to find an alternative, you talked about setting up your own Raspberry Pi in the basement and doing your own thing. It's a huge amount of work to try to avoid them. So what I would like to see is, number one, a life without these big platforms to be a viable option which people can make as an intentional choice, but as a choice which doesn't necessarily dominate your life. You don't have to, your entire digital existence does not need to be dedicated to avoiding them. You can avoid them if you want to, just like people who don't want to shop at Walmart won't shop at Walmart. You have that level of consumer choice. That's the first thing. And that requires a lot of different policy and market changes and architectural changes from what we have now. That's what I would like to see. The related aspect to that is I want to see a world where none of these platforms can exercise dominance over their sphere, where there is real viable competition, whether it's over cloud services, whether it's over website hosting, whether it's over AI, where we really do see competition, and there's no one or handful of companies that are dominant in any one sector. I think those two values, we see that reflected in across all kinds of industries. Once upon a time, again, going back to these free market ideas, once upon a time, these were pillars of the free market. And I think we have that expectation in a lot of different industries. We should have the same expectation here.
If I may add to that, I think that what we haven't touched on here is our dependencies. We're looking at our dependencies as users, as individuals, but also our institutions. Our courts, our universities, our hospitals, they don't have meaningful choice. Mm-hmm. And I think that this is where, of course, no one would force, I also don't want to be forced not to use my Apple computer, which I do own an Apple computer. But when I think about how dependent our institutions and critical infrastructure, critical sectors are, that's where I start understanding how centralization has become a core and a very big problem for that needs to be addressed. Before coming here, I looked up what the latest abbreviations for the big tech is. So FANG would be the Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, Google, the old abbreviation, which I like because it has kind of a bad connotation with it. And then Mango is the new little abbreviation, apparently. Microsoft, Anthropic, Nindia, Google, DeepMind, and OpenAI. Yeah. So there. Let's give more options to more fruit around it.
In the 1990s, a philosopher of technology, Andrew Feenberg, wrote a book called Critical Technology. And there's this one quote in that book that really stands out to me and a lot of my work that I think is relevant here, which is, "The only consensus value left in modern society is efficiency," which is precisely the value we're trying to push aside so that others may flourish. And so I guess my question is this reality we're living in of an overly centralized internet environment, tech environment, in which there's only a few players controlling the show, is this just the kind of logical conclusion of our obsession with efficiency? And if so, is kind of pushing for an open internet or a decentralized internet, does that require us as a collective, as a society, to adopt another value that's more important than efficiency? Because you could make the argument, right, that the fact that we all go to Google Docs as our default is actually an efficiency response. It's the quickest way to get it done. And if we had this fractured and open internet with all of these different intermediaries, this would create a bunch of inefficiency, right? This would slow things down. Choice creates problems, right? That creates transaction costs that we don't want in terms of economic efficiency. So I guess my question is there some other value that, underneath all of this discussion of an open internet, is there some other value that you are arguing is more important than efficiency? And if so, what is it?
No, please go ahead.
Yeah. So I think in the social aspect is probably one that I think I can address. We currently live in a world where all of our social networks, if you take X, Instagram, and Facebook, are use an ad-supported business model. So advertisement, clicking on advertisements is how they get paid. And they use algorithmic feeds to drive clicks on those ads, right? So the whole point of the algorithm is to keep you hitting ads or at least scrolling, right? The point is, please keep using this platform and occasionally hit some ads so we get some money. And buy something cheap and weird from Temu. And I think that we have seen the effect of that principle above all, right? Driving people towards ad clicks on our democracies, we talked earlier about health, and especially health for teens and mental health, and for the health of our society too, right? That these engagement-driven algorithms are clearly having a bad effect on how we live our lives, from top to bottom. And so they absolutely don't have to work that way. There's nothing inherent in the technologies that requires us to be, driving young women towards eating disorders, right, et cetera. We could instead optimize these feeds for healthy and beneficial relationships, good senses towards your own body image, right? Ways of thinking of connecting with people that matter to you or connecting to people in your community, right? The algorithm could be working for us instead of against us. And if we think about it that way, like, that's clearly a much more important value that we have, our families, our communities, ourselves, than the efficiency of the Facebook algorithm in driving ad clicks. So if I was going to say, like, do we have values that are more important than efficiency, I think we absolutely do in that case. And we just have to fight for them.
I would add a focus on human, what it is to be human in a world that pushes towards more efficiency. I'm thinking about how we're getting into this mind frame where we have to keep up and at some point compete machines who are extremely efficient. And some of the answers, I cannot attribute this to the right people. The book is Re-Engineering Humanity, reintroducing friction into our automated systems, because humans are not as good at being very quick and efficient as machines are. So I think that we need to go back to celebrating humanity a little bit more than efficiency, because we just cannot keep up. And it's interesting that the narrative in the AI regulation and mostly AI and copyright space has shifted towards a more human-centric narratives. We see, human creativity being threatened by the machines, and I'm not necessarily saying that's the right approach in copyright law, but it's interesting how people are not ready to give up or to compete. Humans are not ready to compete, or might not want to compete machines, and that might be a good narrative to lead us to more humanistic approaches rather than approaches that celebrate efficiency. We won't be able to keep up if we go down that path, I think. And if we're looking at controlling super intelligent systems, I'm not that optimistic. I mean, I'm entering a different discussion there, but it might become even more difficult to tame algorithms and machines that are far more powerful than our brains.
So I'm not an economist, but I believe I've heard it said that unregulated markets have a natural tendency towards consolidation. That is why markets need to be regulated. Because if you don't regulate them, your 20 players turns into 5 players, turns into 2 players, turns into a monopoly. And monopolies are many things, but they're not known for their efficiency. And I think that there's a confusion in terms between efficiency and simplicity. If there's only one place in Halifax where you can get a hamburger, that's very simple. And from that perspective, there is an efficiency there, because anybody who wants a burger knows exactly where they need to go. You know when it's going to be open, and you can go straight there. It's a simple way to live. But it's not efficient. I think efficiency implies a reduction in both costs and in margins. And I don't think we've seen that in the current economy. I think efficiency implies a limitation of harmful externalities, which we definitely do not see in the current economy. It's weird to be making all of these arguments because nobody who knows me would think of me as a big free market guy, but I do think that competition is a huge part of this. And I think that when we think about the challenges and externalities that are caused by this sector and how to address that in a competitive marketplace, that is a different policy conversation. But I think that that policy conversation will be a better place than our current discussion, which seems to kind of revolve around we have these entrenched interests, they're creating harmful externalities, and there doesn't seem to be anything that we can do about it.
I know that we don't have a ton of time.
Yeah, should we do a Q&A? You can do, if you have more questions, yeah, but we could open it up as well, yeah.
Yeah, well, I just had one more question before we open it up, just to kind of, since we're on this question of efficiency and business model and market, and perhaps, Argyri, this is maybe in your realm a little bit more than the others, is what is the business model that pays for a more open and decentralized internet? Is, if the current model is based on advertising revenue, allowing the big platforms to regulate themselves from an IP perspective with all of the costs that come with that, then what's the alternative, I suppose, of an open and decentralized internet in terms of, well, I mean, at the end of the day, you've got to eat. And so someone is going to have to, support this infrastructure financially. And how does that happen?
Okay, so if I had a business model for you, I wouldn't be here at a university. I'd be in business. I joke aside, that's a huge question. No. That is, I think, for my money, the one of, if not the most important questions. I see three pillars of exploration that we need here. I think there's the technological questions and like, how do we build out new infrastructure and solve these technical challenges? I think there's the law and policy component. And I think the third leg of the stool for a good project in this space is around developing a business model because people don't like surveillance tech. I think that a lot of people who are involved in this space are involved because they don't want to see a repeat of surveillance tech. Okay, so that's out. But where does that leave us in terms of developing an effective business model, especially when you're facilitating adversarial interoperability, so it's harder to lock in your users and get your subscription money, especially when you're talking about like almost all of the fundamental pillars that we're talking about here cut directly counter to the established way to run a business. And that's especially true when you consider that the typical business model for tech companies is to get essentially pumped up through VC funds to unsustainable levels, and then essentially running as glorified pump and dump schemes, which I'm assuming we don't want to be the business model that drives this thing as well. So there needs to be a fundamental rethinking of how this economy is sustained, because it does need to be sustained. So, that's a lot of words for me to take your question and be like, that's such a good question that we need to answer. I don't have an answer for it, but I think it's legitimately one of the most important areas of research.
I don't think it's going to be one size fits all, right? I think that it is probably fair to look at some of the open communications systems that we currently have, like email, and look at how that service is provided, right? So most employers provide email for their employees to use at work, right? So that's one way, one model for providing that service. Another is that there are advertising-supported email systems, and they'll probably remain, or software as a service where you pay a subscription in order to get access to the service, and it's very direct and very straightforward. In some cases, we have provision of services that is through municipal or provincial or federal governments, right, that say this communication is important enough that we're going to provide it for citizens. So I think that it's likely that the more open a system is, the more likely we'll have lots of different business models that work in there. I keep doing this, and so more choices, and hopefully a more open market for those. If I was going to do one more plug here, it's that like Michael says, like there is a lot of opportunity when you have openness, right? And Cory Doctorow talks in his book about the opportunity of having this openness for Canada and other countries, right? Some businesses are going to take these openness opportunities and become the provider of open technology to Asia, to Africa, to Europe, et cetera. And so there's a real, opportunity here for investment.
Yeah, I agree with Evan, and also it's not a one size fits all, but
Yeah.
Allowing more innovation in specific sectors. That would be the way to go probably. Do we want to?
Yeah. So, how much time do we have, Michael?
Till 1:45, I think.
Okay. Some questions from the audience? Yes, here.
So I'm long enough in the tooth to go back to remember when the phone companies wouldn't give up telephone poles to other telecom services. And I'm also in memory where I can remember using Harvard graphics as opposed to PowerPoint. And it just seems to me that all of the problems that you've cited here have not been solved. They've been moderated slightly by litigation, but certainly not by regulation at all. And it just seems to me that the answer in the end, and I think you've all mentioned it in one way or the other, I think Michael laid it out in the three terms, is first of all is the architecture. Mm-hmm. Secondly is the access and interoperability. And the third element is the regulation. The regulation has not been successful over the last 50 years in terms of dealing in the telecommunications area, and I'm classifying the internet as telecommunications in a relative sense. So until they get those three things in line together, I don't think you're going to have a solution to the problem of a decentralized internet that will give us all access. I've had experiences being a Luddite in my dotage with dealing with Microsoft, with them requiring me to go to Outlook, even despite I had an internet service provider in terms of access to email, and also demanding certain things that you do. They wouldn't allow you to function otherwise. So my experience is just a paradigm of all the problems that have been cited. And until we get those three things right, get them right, primarily regulation, and I think regulation will be the last thing to come forward, because the government has too many other things to worry about other than that. But I applaud you for the discussion today, because until those three things happen, I don't think we're going to see any change.
Do you mind if I jump in there? Yeah. I think one of the things that happens, especially early on in a technological revolution, is that there's a lot of pressure on regulators to back off, right? Don't step in here and ruin this by trying to set your rules on it, man. We're having a good time, and we're having this like emergent explosive behavior. Usually with successful communications revolutions, technological revolutions, that goes for a little too long, right? We get past the point where being hands-off is productive, and regulators stay hands-off a little too long, and it's part of why we get this consolidation and centralization. I think that it would be hard to say that in 2025, areas like search or social networking benefit from a hands-off approach, right? It's now a time that regulators should be stepping in and saying, we'd like to see competitive markets. We see a stabilized technology, and it's time to start seeing more productive competition.
Oh, can I just jump in? Well, first of all, yeah, quick shout out to Harvard Graphics, because I think I learned on that as well, and I miss it.
It was actually a better thing.
Yeah, I think I'm still better on that than I am on PowerPoint, but
I can remember as well that when the Nova Scotia Technology Network came into place, it was the internet, and there was all kinds of sites, and nobody was home.
yeah. But I do want to say that political will is obviously going to be an issue here. We've talked about that a bunch of times today. I think that that's more the case now with when our government is anxious about doing anything that angers big tech companies. But the interesting thing about this problem is, so the best thing to do would be like a big coordinated move to try to completely change things and hit the current system with a sledgehammer and turn it into something better. But this is also the kind of problem that you can make progress by nibbling around the edges on. And there's a lot of people, there's people at this table that are making their own progress and making their own, trying to take incremental steps forward on this. And I do think that individual researchers trying to develop innovative technological solutions, individual policymakers trying to look at reform campaigns. This is an area where dramatic progress would be great, but incremental progress still is possible, and there's all kinds of ways to engage.
So I would love to hear your thoughts on my question at every session about alternative regulatory frameworks, so that, we've talked about decentralization, we talked about centralization. So when you have centralization, the only option is not decentralization, right? We have centralized telecom networks, we have centralized broadcast. So could you talk about why, even 3 panels in, we don't talk about these alternative ways to regulate centralized platforms to get decentralized outcomes, right? So I'd love to hear, especially Evan, and I mean, I know Michael's thoughts because we talk a lot about this, so I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts about that, and why don't we think about regulating some of these core internet infrastructures as, again, common carriers or public utilities, or having telecom-like obligations?
I agree. Why don't we? Political will, and then I'll pass over to
No,
Evan.
that's okay. I mean, I think, part of it for us here in Canada is that the American companies don't listen that much when we try and regulate them, right, into particular formats. I think news is a great example with Meta. We tried to set up a regulated system that would insist on a particular form for participation in our news environment, and they said no, and they opted out, and they withdrew from that entire market. And you want to go ahead?
I mean, but you can't, in any other sector, you couldn't do that. You can't be like, I'm going to sell a car and I'm not putting in seatbelts, right?
Right.
So why is it that tech they can do that?
I think partly because they're south of the border. I think the other part is, current trade structure makes it really hard. And partly is they are so international that, losing that amount of traffic from Canadian citizens and participants is they're willing to do that in order to scare off regulators in other countries, right? They did the same thing in Australia a few years ago, right? And so I think it's a possibility, right? I think it's definitely something that is worth doing. I would feel really uncomfortable about, say, regulated monopolies in some of these spaces, but definitely getting these big tech companies under more control makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Maybe take a question over here. No? Here? Yeah, sure.
So, as much as I like and appreciate the idea of, decentralization, I was also thinking about, one challenge pops up to my mind, and I really want to know how you think about it. and it's the reinventing the wheel when we are talking about decentralization. And I think that that could probably be a challenge. What do you think of it? Thank you.
Are you talking about literally reinventing the wheel?
In the technologies, for example, when you want to decentralize, you're technically going to, rebuild some of the infrastructure.
Oh, yeah.
You're going to rebuild some of the, networks.
Okay, so there's two components to this. So one is, a lot of what we're talking about, the technology is quite simple. So if Anthony and I want to collaborate on a document, right, it's not particularly difficult to have an open source and decentralized application to do that. I mean, I couldn't build it myself because for any number of reasons, but people have. And there's a lot of examples where people have just built kind of open source decentralization, because the technology is not rocket science for a lot of this stuff. There is a broader infrastructure question, which is the fact that there are fundamental differences in network flows that are required for a robust decentralized system, as opposed to a system which is meant to facilitate tons of traffic going to a few different hubs. I don't know the degree to which that requires like actual new things being stood up and put in the ground. If only there was someone from the CRTC that we could ask that. But there are significant network implications to having that kind of shift done on a national scale or transnational scale. I'm at the very, very, very edge of my understanding, so I'll speak carefully, that, as far as I understand it, this isn't a question of something that is trying to roll out an entirely new network. Certainly the projects that I've been looking at are always meant to be backwards compatible, as opposed to something that would require all the physical infrastructure to change, because anything that requires new physical infrastructure to be rolled out is just never going to get off the ground. But for the most part, almost all of the applications that you are familiar with, that you use day to day, they're not that complicated to design. And there are some security questions to overcome, but it's not like you're trying to come up with the world's first word processor all over again.
I would also, tying perhaps the two questions together, going back to the previous question, why don't we have more ideas as to how to regulate in this space between centralized and decentralized options? And I think that we lack imagination, but why do we lack imagination? I'll go back to the path dependency piece that I touched on earlier. Our technologies are rooted in history and in social context. They're not, the technology doesn't just appear one day. It's a product of a particular group of people that find themselves at a particular time and space, and you can really, I think we need to be critical and look back to the technologies that we're talking about and see how they came to be as dominant as they are now, and yeah, that we will see why we lack imagination when it comes to ways to regulate them. It's still difficult, I think, for us to go back to the internet history and accept that the cyber libertarian ethos was the ethos adhered by a number of mostly male engineers in North America, right? And unless we keep reminding ourselves of that, we're not going to allow the space, not only for regulators, but for anyone that thinks in this space, to be imaginative, to imagine new solutions. And I was earlier thinking about how we all converge to the keyboard, which is the current keyboard is not the most efficient of solutions. But then again, there's merit in networks, infrastructure being widespread, adopted in a widespread manner, and also I liked how you wanted to separate a simple solution versus an efficient solution, but there's value in simplicity as well. There's value in having, when we're talking about, sharing our document in the same platform, knowing which are that we both know where we're going. We both know what the environment looks like. There's value in it, right? Which is the tension that you mentioned earlier.
1 minute left.
There was one here.
A very good evening. Thank you for this wonderful talk. I just want to ask you, Michael, see, in your opening remarks, you said the decentralization basically is to removing the monopoly of 3-4 companies. But forgive me for my name, but I feel that we are looking at a very scary picture. For example, when we talk about the decentralized financial institutions, when we remove the middleman, and suppose I need to borrow money and you want to lend the money, so that is a very major challenge for the terror financing, money laundering. So that is a major challenge, even for that matter. A few months back, FATF also issued a threat that some companies are indulged into that. How we are going to tackle with that problem? So that's my question.
Okay, I'll be very quick and say, personally, I've actually never really been much of an advocate for cryptocurrencies. Crypto means cryptography, not cryptocurrencies. But and this isn't an area that has been a major area of specialization, because honestly, I think fintech is a complicated area, and I'm not really somebody that does a lot of research into financial regulation generally. The only kind of vague feeling that I have about this space is it needs to be way more regulated than it is, and it seems like a pretty big regulatory gap for all of these reasons that you mention. So I would separate out my interest in decentralized communication technologies from advocacy of decentralized finance. There are people that go in a different direction. I'm sure people would accuse me of being inconsistent between those two. I view them as separate issues, but that's just where I stand.
Yeah, I agree. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution. And also, I think we also need to critique that narrative that we get rid of the middleman. There's another middleman in the decentralized financial network architecture. So maybe we just need to focus on whether we're actually replacing a model that doesn't work very well with a model that perhaps brings more vulnerabilities for the user. But I would also separate these sectors, and I'm not an expert in fintech by no means. Yeah.
All right, so we'll take a quick break and reconvene at the top of the hour. Thanks very much, everybody.